Hi everyone. Thank you, Steph, for inviting me here. As Steph mentioned, if you've never seen me before, I am a historian, I'm a teacher, an author, and I also work in history curriculum. My main area of specialism is in British women's history. I've got a particular focus on the invisibility of women in history, like how have we got here, and crucially, how do we get out of this? Now, we've got limited time tonight, so let's make it count. I'm going to talk about what the wandering womb was. No, it's not made up, I can assure you of that. What caused it, how is it treated, and crucially, what is its legacy? Now, before we do anything, I am going to ask you to start from a space of recognizing that women's healthcare is built on historic understandings of the female body. When I met with Steph recently and she invited me here, this was the first thing, the wandering womb, that popped into my mind. And I know that to some extent I'm preaching to the choir right now, but I really want to emphasize to you that these historic ideas about women's bodies are everywhere. They are even built into modern language. So, for example, how many times have you used the idiom having a bun in the oven to describe somebody being pregnant? Probably loads of times, right? And so have I. Now, sorry, the first time that idiom was used in the English language was, I believe, in 1951. But it rests on origins that are so much older, that are actually thousands of years old. And by the end of this today, I will hopefully have proven to you that this idea of the uterus as a heated container, as a space that grows something from seed, is still central to how we understand the female body. So let's start with the basics of this idea. Like, what was the wandering womb and where did it come from? So, really simply, the wandering womb is an ancient idea that the uterus was not fixed in place. It was an independent, mobile organism that could, and it did frequently, dislodge itself from its proper position and travel around. And as it traveled around the female body, it caused blockages and it pressed on other organs. And the result of this was a wide range of emotional and physical issues, anything from things like melancholy and sadness, suffocation, heart attacks, mental illness, and even death. So for women, the uterus was perceived as a very serious threat to health and well-being. Now, where did it come from? Probably the oldest reference to the idea of the wandering womb was made by Hippocrates in some time during the 5th century BC. Now, from his observations, he argued that the uterus could wander around and cause illness in the female body. Now, because there was so little understanding of women's biology and, of course, of men's biology too, the term hysteria was used to describe most of the illnesses that women experienced. And let's not forget that the word hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, which just means uterus, right? That's all that it means. Now, Hippocrates wasn't the only physician to comment on the uterus's ability to just move around and cause a bit of chaos. I'm sure you've all heard of this guy. So, in the 4th century BC, the Greek philosopher Plato described the uterus as a living thing inside her that is desirous of childbirth. We'll come back to that a bit later on. The full quote's here if you want to come back and read it, because I know that Steph is going to share the slides with everyone. There was also another well-known Greek physician, Aretaeus of Cappadocia. He described the uterus as an animal inside an animal, so a living thing inside of another living thing. But the question is, why did this so-called animal go rogue and wander around? To answer that, we do have to remember that the dominant medical model of the classical period was the theory of the four humours. So this is the idea that the body is comprised of four humours. And if they become imbalanced in any way, disease follows. So, for example, one of the four humours was phlegm. And doctors believe that if you had a little bit too much phlegm, you would become lethargic and you could develop a respiratory illness. And the only way to fix that was to purge the phlegm to remove the excess so that you would feel better. And this model went pretty much unchallenged all the way through the classical period, all the way through the Middle Ages, and well into the early modern period. Humoral theory also applied to how people understood the nature and the composition of the female and male bodies. So physicians like Galen believed that men's bodies were naturally hot and dry, and women's bodies were the complete opposite. They were cold and they were moist. And this even explained, in classical minds, why women needed to have a period. Every single month, the female body needed to release, to purge that excess moisture. But here is the key. Here's the bit that we need to be really concerned about. Humoral traits were mapped onto social expectations. So because they were cold and moist, women were clearly too emotional and unstable and unsuitable for leadership. Conversely, men were considered to be rational, natural leaders because they were naturally hot and dry. And while this idea might not seem that serious, it was because this was used to justify patriarchal values, patriarchal practices in societies all across Europe, including in England. Now, if we if we apply humoral theory to the uterus specifically, then what physicians believed was that this cold, moist organism would actively seek out the elements that it lacked. So that heat and that dryness. And this is why it starts to wander. Now let's talk about some treatments for this. If you were an unwell woman in the classical, medieval, or the early modern period, and you were went to see a physician, how might you be treated? Well, you better believe for a start that a physician would probably assume your uterus had something to do with the problem. And you also better believe that physicians who were by and large male, not all of them, I will say, but by and large were male, busied themselves with finding all manner of cures for these so-called hysterical women. Now, the most obvious and most commonly prescribed treatment was to get married and to have a child, because sex with a man would give the uterus that heat and that dryness that it naturally lacked. And therefore, sex with a man brought the female body back into a state of harmony. This harmony would satisfy the uterus and keep it anchored in that correct part of the body. So anytime someone talks about having a bun in the oven, they're referencing this very old, in fact, ancient belief, even if they don't realize that that's what they're talking about. There were, of course, a range of other treatments as well, adiferous therapy, which is sometimes called fumigation. So it was also believed that the uterus was naturally repelled by things that didn't smell nice. And therefore, it was attracted to things that smelled good and it would follow them. So perfumes, flowers, nice smelling incense, all of these could be employed to entice the uterus back into its proper place and to bring that body back into harmony. Bloodletting is an interesting one. This was used as a kind of preventative and also a cure. So the idea behind this is that by purging the body of these excess or toxic fluids, in this case blood, usually by cutting open a part of the body, or leeches was really common, it would strengthen the body overall. It would strengthen the individual organs, and therefore the uterus would have no power over them. It wouldn't be able to just wander up and start causing chaos. We see this one used a lot in medieval medicine. And there were other preventative measures too. So, regular bathing, tightly wrapping the body in oil bandages. These were also believed to discourage the uterus from dislodging itself and moving, because the bath and the bandages provided the heat that the uterus craved and that the female body lacked. So, what we see then is that the wandering womb was a medical myth that justified both the control of the female body, but also justified women's narrow roles in society. The idea that a woman might be anything other than a wife or a mother was literally bad for her health. So, for how long did this idea persist? Well, probably a lot longer than it ought to have done. In fact, it was at least until the 18th century, when advances in anatomy through dissection began to disprove the idea that the uterus was mobile, that it was an independent organism that had the capacity to just physically roam around the body. But the legacy of the wandering womb lived on well into the 20th century, um, in the form of the diagnosis of female hysteria, which, as we all know, became a catch all and also a dismissive term for a range of symptoms experienced by women. Now, arguably, there are still elements of humoral theory and the wandering womb at play in the way that we talk about women. Like I mentioned one already, that idiom, bun in the oven. But I think about it particularly in the context of the way that women's hormones and emotions are both problematized and then weaponized against women. There's also persistent ideas about women's capacity for leadership, and we are still yet to see women equally represented in leadership, no matter the field that we look at. Earlier this year, there was a study by Capgemini, and it found that 63% of men believe that having a female leader impacts a business positively. Now, that's a lot lower, to be honest, than I would have expected in 2025. But what I find really interesting about this study is that only 74% of women thought that women are suitable for leadership and could benefit a business in a position of leadership. And I think it's really sad that so many women have internalized these harmful historic ideas about their capacities, about their ability to step up and outside into the public domain. But at the same time, is that really so surprising when women have been told for what, 2,500 years, if not longer, that it's dangerous for you to put your head above the parapet? It's very dangerous. It will literally harm your health. Then there's also this idea of women's agency and the objectification of the female body by the political establishment. The wandering womb rested on the idea that women were passive agents in reproduction. They were literally just hanging around, waiting for a man to choose them, waiting to get married, and then impregnate them. Revisiting this idea and its legacy feels really relevant at a time when literally millions of women across the world are fighting for reproductive rights and also fighting to have a voice in their own medical care, fighting to be heard about their own bodies. So, although the wandering womb may seem like an archaic, almost made up idea, I encourage you to look critically at language, our relationships, our internalized beliefs about men and about women, and our political systems. Because when you look in those spaces, you will realize that archaic ideas about the female body are very much alive and well.